Hello, and this is the Complexitist view on animals, or the animal problem, so to speak. So I've never really talked about animals or animal ethics on this channel. It's much sort of, I'm more of a, grand theory kind of guy and less of a specific issue, because the animal thing seems like a specific issue. However, with recent events and recent thoughts, realized some things. Is that, the animal problem, and I mean, I always sort of knew this, but the animal problem is sort of a unique problem ethically because of, it's a question of, more generally, of a question of how does ethics extend, outside of familiar territory. It's very familiar territory if you look at just like human interaction and politics and stuff like that. It's much more intuitive. It's pretty clear that it's pretty clear how and why ethics applies to those kinds of systems and how it applies. And no one's really going to question the idea that the values of human beings matter and stuff like that. Once you extend past that, you want to include other life forms, it becomes tricky, and you start to, you have to consider as well things like artificial intelligence and meta life forms and abstract kinds of organisms like societies and stuff like that. But things become, more sort of, the further the departure, the trickier things become, and at the same time, things become sort of less important, but at the same time, they're not. It's still important. It's still relevant at some underlying, way, because even if particular hardships of animals or other non-human beings is less important than human hardships, the problem is the value system by which we judge human hardships. Some aspect of it has to carry over. So the question is, what carries over? And the idea is, in line with this whole grand unified ethical theory approach that I always take, is that if there is a grand theory, then that grand theory would have to, it's actually possible to figure out the sort of the dimensions of this theory in clearer terms if you look at systems of non-humans. As purely, then you can't see ethics as a purely like human concept. So there's definite like usefulness in trying to look at the animal systems with regards to the grand theory approach, which is what I always take, and that's what complexitism is. So let's get into it, and this is going to be, I guess, a bit more of a summary. But yeah, basically, I think that the idea of complexity. I don't want to call it complexity maximization anymore, because people have misinterpreted that and taken it to be like some scalar quantity maximization. I want to think about, like, the thing with complexity is that the idea of complexity extends to like animal systems and other systems very easily. So, like I said in like the complexitist view on human rights thing, is that rights are basically a tool, and they're a very important tool. They're part of like how politics and human interactions work, but they're not the underlying moral, ethical rule set, basically. At best they're a rule set for a society, but not for individual actions, and not for specific value calculations. It's the same thing with animals. So in the same sense, animal rights don't really exist in that sense. They exist in a sort of they exist as sort of an abstract legal construct that is useful but not ultimately, fundamentally true. The other thing I want to talk about, it's not just animal rights, but it's this bigger idea of suffering minimization, and how important it is, and whether or not it's important to try and reduce the suffering of animals. Because the thing about animals, the thing about other life forms is, well, it's interesting. Some other life forms don't experience any kind of suffering in the same sense that human beings do. Any kind of subjective suffering. The same way, like, if you punch someone or hurt them, they're feeling suffering. And but some animals do, and humans do. and it's certainly a more of a, you know, higher mammalian developmental trait. You know, it's like if you have nociception and certain level of neurological development, then you experience, you know, pain and suffering. And so all of a sudden it's like a new system of rules applies. Of course, I don't think that the line is so, you know, I don't think the line is so, like, you know, discrete. I don't think it goes from like 0 to 1 instantly. Like, you know, the experiences of the living thing don't matter whatsoever, you know, and suddenly they start mattering if there's pain. However, from the perspective of pain minimization, you know, if you're just going to look at that, then of course certain living things don't matter whatsoever because they don't experience pain. Certain animals don't experience pain, you know. So when we talk about animal rights, certain animals don't feel things. You know, insects don't have nociception. You could squash all the insects you want. I still wouldn't do it. You know, I still, you know, personally, I feel sort of horrified at the idea of hurting even an insect, even though I know that the insect can't actually feel anything. You know, but that's more of like a personal, that's more of a personal thing. It's how I make sure that I'm not a monster myself, you know, to hurt any living thing for no fucking reason, you know. It's how serial killers start doing their thing. They start by torturing cats or whatever, and then they move up the food chain. But anyway, the point is, so, you know, with regards to complexitism, the sort of the value of the experience of the life form is more of a continuous sort of, you know, flow from the simplest life forms to the most complex. It's not something that's just, it doesn't matter whatsoever and then suddenly it matters. And of course, you know, with complexitism, the value of every single life form ultimately boils down to how it sort of works within this idea of, you know, increasing the complexity of the universe. You know, more complex life forms, their experiences matter more, because their experiences are more complex, obviously. You know, creatures that can experience pain are more valuable than creatures that can't. And from a complexity perspective, keeping, you know, living things that are more complex alive is more important. If I had to choose between preserving a plant or preserving my dog, or just not even just a random dog, the answer is obvious which one I should, you know, should save, right? So there's some kind of pattern like that with regards to, you know, how the species contributes. And, you know, again, the thing with complexitism is there's, you know, so much that I haven't exactly, like, eloquently worked out yet, but the pattern seems pretty clear, and it's pretty fair for me to think that there is something very intuitive about this idea of complexity and how it extends the human value system past other humans. You know, and given that, you know, there's a very sort of obvious function for empathy for other humans, and hence a drive to reduce their suffering within, you know, human society, such a drive should also exist for animals at, you know, more and more marginally diminishing sort of instincts, the less complex the animal. So the less complex the animal, the less invested I should be in trying to keep that animal, you know, alive and, you know, not in pain. And it gets down to a point where it's almost zero. Now, the value reduces to zero for the individual organism. You want to consider organisms as a whole. Which organisms as a whole are more important? That is, you know, that is a more complex question, because the rules that apply to groups are not the same rules that apply to individuals. You know, if you ask me, it's like, well, we could, you know, destroy all the grass in the world or kill all the squirrels. You know, it's probably worse within the idea of complexitism to, you know, destroy the grass, because of how, you know, it's sort of, each individual blade of grass is less important, but grass as a class is more important in terms of how it supports the system, you know, the naturalistic system. It's kind of like if you look at human society, it's a question of like farmers and doctors. You know, a doctor, you know, each doctor is more important than any individual farmer, but farmers as a group are way more important, you know, than doctors. So, you know, you have things like that. So, you know, if you have to make judgments like that, the obvious, you know, judgments should be made. the thing I want to just distinguish is this idea that, like, you know, how ultimately are we going to try to reduce the suffering of animals within the wild and within the world? Because if you think about it, animals, it's pretty easy for an animal to suffer. I mean, an animal can you know, they can get to all kinds of shit. They can, you know, be unfed. They can be eaten, you know, et cetera, et cetera. And all of that stuff is a lot, like, less bad for an animal than it would be for a human. Part of that is the fact that they can't even really conceive of, you know, that situation. And I do obviously believe that, you know, the amount of suffering that all of these, like, scenarios carry has to do with how you perceive that suffering in a lot of ways. You know, if you're suffering and it's just pain, but it's a totally healthy pain, it's part of growing or whatever, then it doesn't matter as much as if you're suffering because there's a fucking, like, bone that's broken or something that's dysfunctional. Dysfunctional suffering is worse than functional suffering, basically. And, you know, how that relates to this is, like, you know, if an animal isn't as badly off as a human would be in that scenario, because a human can actually understand, you know, what they're experiencing, and given that they can understand, that adds to their suffering. So it's a lot worse than if it's an animal that doesn't know what the fuck's going on. So there's that issue. But it's still an important issue, you know, in the same vein that I wouldn't, like, go out and try to just kill, you know, insects unless they were invading the house or whatever. Or I wouldn't go out of my way to try and hurt animals, especially, like, vertebrate, you know, developed animals that, you know, can experience pain and can have more complex experiences, you know, animals that could even experience joy and positive emotions. Just like I wouldn't go out to try and hurt them, there's an obvious moral argument to be made that there's reason to try and help them and to try and reduce whatever suffering they can experience. So I'm all for doing that in whatever way is sort of necessary. Well, sorry, not whatever way is necessary. I'm not for doing it in whatever way is necessary, because, you know, you take that, you say that to the wrong people, and they'll suddenly come up with the conclusion that, oh, well, then it's just okay to, you know, sterilize all of them, because that's not, you know, throwing away anything that's important. Right. Obviously, what I'm saying is that you have to try and reduce their suffering without throwing away anything that's important, which is the existence of the genetic lines themselves. Right, because there's a reason to want, you know, there's a reason to value the life of the species, you know, not just the life of any individual animal. So sterilization and, you know, any kind of pro-extinction movement is, you know, a deal breaker as far as I'm concerned. In fact, I would say that anyone who honestly, like, follows that kind of path should just be disqualified from the conversation. Like, there's no justification for anything. It's just like, it's some sort of hypersensitive, like, bleeding heart extremism at that point. The way I see it is that extreme is like taking the lesser evil, which is just, let's kill all, you know, destroy all the life forms, and, you know, taking it as if it's the only option. And the way I see it is that it's a lesser evil. You know, the only thing that's preferable about destroying all the animals is if any alternative would be even worse for the animals. So it's not something you just want to do. You know, it's not something that it even makes sense to contemplate unless there are no other options, unless we're living in some sort of dystopia level event where, you know, it's bye-bye world and there's nothing but fucking catatonic, you know, Armageddon up ahead. Well, then, yeah, sure. Then you can contemplate being voluntary extinction. But, you know, until then, you have to come up with solutions whilst trying to retain that which has positive value, which is a lot harder. And that's why any of this like pro-extinction fucking movements, I just kind of, they're not just disappointing on a moral level. They're disappointing on like a, so they're not just disappointing on a positive like value level. They're disappointing on a like a solution level. Like they're easy solutions. It's a super simple, you know, answer to a very complicated question. And I am always just like, I hate that shit. I hate whenever people try to come up with simple answers to like complex questions. But it's just the same shit that economics does, and It drives me fucking crazy. But that's exactly what this is, and that's exactly what Complexitism tries not to do. Stay away from the easy answers. The truth is, I think there's a lot of answers. There's a lot of ways of reducing the suffering that animals experience whilst retaining the integrity of, their right, or their the necessity of having them exist. Obviously, you can breed animals in captivity. Obviously, you can do current day things like that. In the long run, of course, and I might talk about something like this in one of my hypothetical utopia videos, but in the long run, there's all kinds of crazy technological solutions that you could implement. For one, you could construct incredibly elaborate, habitats for, ecosystems, basically, for animals that are perfectly functional, that are, basically free of disease in any serious sense. There's no serious disease plaguing these animals, and these are functional ecosystems, so they don't collapse or anything like that. There's no threat of predation, and there's no threat of going hungry. Basically, if anything, you could also make the animals immortal, because might as well. If we're interested in making human beings immortal, might as well be interested in making animals immortal. I mean, if that's an option, then we can contemplate taking that option. But the point is, there's a way of, or in the worst case scenario, what you could do is you could always implement some way to just euthanize any animal that's in too serious of a problem. Animal gets a little too hurt, euthanize it. That's sort of what they already do in parks, like national parks, like Yellowstone. There's a story where they euthanized a buffalo because some idiots touched it. So yeah, there's stuff like that you could do. There's also this idea of trans-animalism, which is sort of which I've thought of, and that can go in any number of ways. You could, for one, like I said, you can make it so that animals don't die and they're immortal, just like humans. And then, of course, they don't need to. You have to make sure that they don't breed too much, so that there's not too many of them. You could make it so that animals don't actually. You could do a thing where you can trans-animalize them. Basically, the way we have transhumanism, which is supposed to enhance human beings and make us more futuristic, cybernetic enhancements, immortal, etc. You could do the same thing with animals and slowly metamorphose them into sapient beings, effectively, that could communicate with us. And at that point, that could be a very interesting, option to see if some sort of sci-fi craziness, but it could be a very interesting option to see what that even looks like, because it would be like a consciousness that starts out as an animal but grows into a living consciousness that you could actually talk to, and then it could recount its experiences. It might be very interesting, if it recalls its memories as a deer or whatever. Of course, with transhumanism, all the rules are thrown out the window. You could have people that just decide to look like animals if they want to. I could theoretically make my body look like a tiger because I fucking feel like it, and I could just hop around and do shit like a tiger, and it's and then that'll be my life. You could do stuff like that. There's also the whole mega consciousness idea that I talked about in Hypothetical Utopia 4. You could take all the consciousness of animals and humans and just wrap them all up into one thing. I don't know or think that that's necessarily preferable. I kind of, we'd have to see, whether or not that's even a preferable option. But, retaining some level of individuality feels like, not individuality, but some level of individual identity seems like a preferable idea, a preferable thing in a sense. So, but the point is, there's all kinds of ways in which you could potentially permanently fix the problems that animals have. And there's animals that, live and exist today that don't exactly experience what anyone would call a miserable existence. They, like dogs that are your pets. They live and then they grow old and then they die. And speaking of the immortality of animals thing, that would definitely be something that's in demand for people who have pets. They just want their pets not to die. Who wants if they're going to be immortal themselves, why would they want their dog not to be immortal? So you have you have shit like that popping up. But mostly, this habitat idea. You could construct it in a way where the animals could just sort of live there and do their thing and have their animal experience, whilst utterly, being able to intervene, the second any kind of suffering shows up and, kill it out of existence. Sort of like euthanasia in case there's insane suffering. And you might ask the question, okay, well, what's the point of all this? If I'm just in favor of increasing complexity, what the fuck does this shit have to do with what the fuck does this suffering reduction stuff have to do? Well, the thing is, increasing complexity isn't just about, the concept of complexity isn't divorced from this concept of reducing suffering. And I've talked about this in a previous video, but I think you're not really you're not really increasing this striving for this complexity thing if you're not reducing suffering at the same time. Because, part of what we are, part of who we're supposed to be, is these beings that, reduce the suffering of other beings. Because if we reduce the suffering of other beings, these other beings are now free to have their experiences, which is supposed to help elevate the complexity of the system. So, in the same sense that, there's a complexity is obviously tied with whether or not human beings are experiencing suffering. Any human being that's suffering is not ideal within a complexitist perspective, because they're not moving forward with regards to any kind of positive value. They're not pushing anything forward. They're just suffering. Their whole existence is capitulated on, on ceasing whatever fucking thing that they're doing. I think, did I use that word wrong? No, I used the word wrong. Never mind. Their whole existence is bent upon, trying to cease this experience of suffering. So they're not actually, doing anything of positive value with that. It's all about escaping, not about, bringing something into the world. It would be the same thing with all animals. And I mean, if we're going to have to... The only question is it possible to have some sort of discrete ethical system where, we have this empathy for other humans, but we have zero empathy for animals? And I feel like, to an extent, if your empathy for animals and animal suffering is reduced and you don't care about that, then I fear for your empathy for other human beings, because I don't see how those things could be totally discrete. I think that, people who don't give a shit about animal rights or whatever are also sort of very there's other things that are important, for humanity that they also will not give a shit about. That's basically the argument. I once had a fucking libertarian guy I was arguing with who made the stupidest fucking argument I've ever heard. My Mike asks him, do animals have rights or whatever? Or rather, somebody asked, do animals have rights? And Mike's like, yes, they do have rights. And this fucking guy says, animals will have rights as soon as they can petition for rights. It's like, what? Seriously? It's like, who fucking believes something like that? It's insane. It doesn't make any sense. Why? Animals have to be able to, communicate with you. It's just an unreasonable standard. It's an unreasonable standard for, animals meriting some kind of fucking basic compassion, right? And so that is, a completely unjustifiable perspective. And this is a libertarian, so of course this is someone who doesn't actually have humanity's best interests at heart either. Not a surprise. So what I'm saying is, if you're not going to take the approach that reducing the suffering of animals and stuff is important, then your perspective of what's important for the human race as a whole is also going to be, possibly going to be distorted and skewed. So that's not okay. So neither of those situations are okay. But of course, the point is, and I still just want to get away from this idea because I didn't even know this extreme existed until a month ago or something. But you cannot, you can't be in favor of reducing suffering in a way that gives up, everything else, as if there's nothing else that's important, as if there's nothing of positive value that you might give up by trying to reduce suffering. That's sort of the problem. That is the extreme, and that is a much worse extreme. Because that's the extreme that always picks the lesser evil, basically, and actively chases the lesser evil and then acts like it's not evil. If it's an ideology that's actively chasing the lesser evil all the time, then it's an evil ideology, even if its intentions are perfectly good. So I think that's just, that is, it's not just as wrong, but it's a lot worse. And yeah, I mean, it's like the argument. It's like saying, it's like saying I hate the fact that Billy is punching Bobby, so I'm gonna punch Bobby so hard that his face explodes so that nobody else could punch him. It's like that. A concept of suffering reduction like that makes no sense because there's no benefit from it. What's the point? The benefit is if Billy stops punching Bobby and there is advancement for the two of them, peaceful advancement. There's no advancement if Billy is fucking Bobby's now dead. Now no one can punch him. It doesn't make any sense. It makes no sense. There's no whatever. I'm not gonna fucking entertain that shit because it's insane. But you get the idea. And basically, with complexitism, the question is always about trying to solve, whatever problem that exists in the system without losing sight, of the point. Without losing sight of the point. And the point is not to reduce suffering whatever means necessary. The point is to progress. The point is to capture this complexity ideal. That's always the point. And in line of that, what that creates is it creates a space where you have to fix every problem without, destroying, without reducing the complexity of the system, without killing any of the species, without extinguishing any of them, making any of them extinct, doing anything radical like that. You just have to fix the problem that they're facing. If you find that there's a problem, there's a little, fucking too many, dogs that are whining or whatever out in the streets, then you fix it. You make a dog shelter or something like that. You come up with a solution, but you don't just, shoot them with an RPG or some shit like that. Yeah, I mean, you always have to keep in mind that there is some sort of with regards to complexity, there's always every single species has sort of a merited reason to exist within this sort of complexity ideal, and in a way where it can proliferate the most in the safest, least adverse possible way. Now, so from that perspective, I'm totally in favor of things like, spreading life around to other planets and stuff like that in ways, in the same ways that we want to have life on this Earth, which is life on Earth in a way that it exists, and we're not ruining the lives of animals, we're not fucking factory farming them, or we're growing our own synthetic meat, and all the other animals, they're perfectly fucking happy doing their thing, or they're maybe not happy, but they're doing their thing without any kind of, with suffering minimized, basically. But that's the ideal, and you want to spread that ideal everywhere, because that's the most, as within sort of, that is the most stable pattern that can proliferate itself the most. There's nothing adverse about a pattern like that. There's nothing wrong with a pattern like that. You want to aim for that. So that's effectively what complexitism, the complexity approach towards animals is going to be like. I mean, I'm talking in very sort of broad strokes and general terms, but, it's hard, it's really hard to come up. I've come up with a few, possible avenues like mega consciousness, trans-animalism and stuff like that. But, other than stuff like that, there is a certain value we find in having the natural world continue to exist around us. So, you know, and having the sort of the Gaia, or not killing off the Gaia organism. So, you know, there is a value in you know, keeping that organism alive, but keeping it alive in a way where it's not suffering internally. It's not needlessly suffering internally, basically. And we have to do that as a result of this empathy virtue, which we need to have, you know, as a result, simply because the empathy virtue is what services, you know, our own, you know, survival and our own existence as a species more than anything. You know, we want to throw away the empathy virtue, then I guess we could, and then fuck the animals, they don't matter. But, like, why would we do that? And how would that, there's no reason to think that, like, throwing away the empathy virtue for non-humans isn't just detaching us from things that are important for humans, and hence distorting our perspective of what's valuable for humans as well. So insofar as we're at least somewhat interested in you know, the positive value of human existence, we have to also be concerned with the positive value of the existence of other living things, and hence them not suffering is of prime interest. So setting up an environment where they can exist without suffering is just as, well, it's not as important as setting up an environment where we can exist without suffering, but it's still a necessary challenge, and it's something that has to be done. And, you know, that's the direction, the only direction, you know, which is a pretty broad direction, but that's the direction that Complexitism sort of aims for. So, yeah, that's my view on that, and cheers. And as always, comments, concerns, disagreements, farewell.